Greetings and salutations. This is what I hope to be one of many quick little data drops that I'm planning to do coming out of the Democratic National Convention. I thought it was the perfect time to kind of dig in real quick on a couple of things that have been kind of hanging over and getting a lot of attention. Number one, I think a lot of you guys tended to notice that the Democratic National Convention had a lot of Republican symbolism throughout. And, you know, the more savvy of you will recognize that as what we would call persuasion symbolism. So things that were meant to appeal specifically to independent voters or even really Republican voters, right? We had some really major Republican speakers like John Kasich coming in, the video from Cindy McCain. And for people who follow my research, especially those that don't really understand its nuances, you might think, well, isn't that exactly opposite of what Rachel Bitecofer's theory argues? You know, no. I mean, if you read my theory, it argues that the appreciation of turnout and the demographic composition and partisan composition of the electorate has been not well understood and underappreciated, and that you really need in the polarized era to hit those turnout numbers for your coalition, which includes, of course, Democrats, which we're not talking about progressives when we talk about the Democratic base only. We're talking about African Americans, we're talking about college educated women, but we're also talking about independents that lean towards Democrats, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. You know, along with this traditional view of independents who swing over, you also have number one, you have a lower percentage of those than people think of, at that 33% in the polls. We're really talking about a much lower percent who are what we call pure independents. My theory talks about how they're predictably breaking against the party in power in the polarized era. And my theory is big, because none of that is me. That's all political science literature. So it's not a novel theory at all. But what my novel argument about independents or swing voters is that the more important or just as important argument about them is a turnout swing. They have a turnout swing. So they enter and exit the electorate in between cycles, and that has a profound impact on the preference of which candidate or which party they're going to break for. So if you looked at this convention, forward-facing, it was a very, very persuasive theme. Almost the entire convention was like that. Now, I don't know how the DNC would have looked prior to the pandemic, but it was actually a very logical choice to make it highly persuasive in the theme because of this pandemic. Because, you know, in this September update, those who have been following me on Twitter or watching the show will know I talk a lot now about how we have these two effects going in favor of the Democrats, in favor of Biden. We have the negative partisanship effect, which has always been there. It's been a structural advantage, and that's what my research talks about. But once this pandemic came in and Trump mismanaged it, which was not, I mean, I think it was always foregone because he's a terribly incompetent person, but it was not a foregone conclusion. He could have handled it well, like many of the other world leaders did. He could have done the things that would manage the pandemic, get the curve, crushed, then do these science-based reopenings and allow society to kind of function at a somewhat normal level, whereas Trump did totally different response, and it's been a total disaster. So when we look at that, we've seen a second effect emerge, and that's called the pandemic effect. And so this fall update is going to really focus on these two concurrent effects going on. And where that pandemic effect has been coming from is predominantly in that independent group, and its additional erosion, both with pure independents breaking more decisively for Biden, but more importantly, I think, is more erosion or some erosion amongst what we call right-leaning independents who have been hanging with Trump really tightly throughout the cycle, throughout the whole presidency. I mean, the last time this group moved in poll data the way that they're behaving now is in October of 2016 when the Access Hollywood video came out. They broke away from Trump and said, I'm not going to vote for this guy. And we saw Clinton's lead expand. Then at the end of the day, they went home and they voted for Trump. They have hung with him through it all. but the pandemic has been too much for them and they have eroded. So when we look at this first slide, that what has inspired me to kind of create the segment, though it had been in my mind for a while. This is some data that came out this weekend from the UNC Dorn's Knife poll. Now this poll, the main headline was that this was a poll that had Trump ahead in the popular vote, which of course, was right by being wrong, right? Trump won the election, but he was never ahead in the popular vote. But it has Trump losing by 11 points in its first iteration for 2020. So that was the main headline. But in the data, it also had this graph that's been, I think it was first shared by Nate Cohen is how I found it. So what it's doing is it's presenting 2016 voters by their vote choice. So it was a 2016 Clinton voter, it was a 2016 Trump voter. What are they planning to do for 2020? And as you can see, pretty much, if you voted for Donald Trump in 2016, you're voting for Donald Trump in 2020. If you voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, you're voting for Joe Biden in 2020. Of the two parties, though, there's an advantage. Whereas Republicans are losing more voters, right? Some of that would be incumbency. Some of it, though, is that loss of, that independent break. But, because keep in mind, this is just putting people by vote choice, not by party. But generally speaking, people have not changed. And a lot of their choice initially in 2016, of course, was driven by that party preference in the first place. And then it looks at, so it really is driven by that 2016 vote choice. And then it looks at preferences for people who voted in 2012 but didn't vote in 16 and voted in 2012 and then voted third party in 2016. And as you can see in those two populations, there is a really strong vote choice advantage for Joe Biden. So what this data means, there's a couple of things that I really want to highlight here. Number one, and I think this is something that I really can't hammer home enough. This is not the first presentation of vote preference for 2020 based on 2016 preference. And I have seen data like this before, and I've seen it before the pandemic, like before the word pandemic came into our lexicon in terms of this giant event. And it's basically unchanged, right? So we've had this massive, political event that, has redefined our lives, that Donald Trump, by every objective measure, has completely fouled up. The American pandemic in global comparison. This is an objective fact. And yet, very few people, compared to the data I saw 8 months ago, have changed when they were testing this question 8 months ago. And, so that's one piece of data. But the other thing is that, when you're looking at this from a campaign strategy perspective, it seems anyway, in terms of campaign resource, very wise to spend investment on getting people to the polls, right? Who did not show up in 2016, because if you're Biden, because if you can, they're going to vote for you more likely than not. I mean, certainly it's not 80-20, but it is a decisive advantage in terms of the Democrats in those lost voters from 2012 who didn't show up in 2016. And the same is true for third-party voters, though it's a little bit less robust. So it suggests that, after all these months, if these major events, this pandemic, which is like 100-year event in itself, and then the mismanagement, I think, too, is very atypical. I don't think you would have seen any other Republican president, handle it in the way that Donald Trump has, as poorly as he has, frankly. Like, if that's not moving people, then it suggests your campaign ads or your digital targeting isn't likely to have much effect with those particular voters. So you might be better off focusing on digging into that data file, those voter targeting files, and finding those people who didn't show up in 2016 that you might be able to motivate and get to the polls who will vote for Democrats in 2020. And one of the reasons I wanted to mention that in context of the convention is, I think Rachel Maddow often says, don't watch what they do, not what they say. So in terms of the convention, they said a lot of things that were really persuasion focused. And I think that a lot of my followers anyway were hand wringing about, oh, are they going to, they're going to blow this. They're going to focus on converting Republicans and blah, 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 blah. Number one, again, in this pandemic world, there is more meat in that persuasion bucket than there would have been. And we can see that in that right-leaning erosion. So it's not as illogical as it might have been to spend more money there. But number two, what they did was they selected Kamala Harris as their running mate for Joe Biden. And so that is really indicative that they are aware that their electoral strategy in terms of the actual meat of it is really contingent on mobilizing that Democratic coalition. Now, people like to say, oh, base mobilization. And again, I don't know if that's a way to diminish the strategy or to dismiss it. Certainly not what I'm talking about. And I don't think it's what the Biden campaign team would be doing. Because again, we're talking about a very broad coalition of people. But with the Harris pick and this Mistress of Factions article with this political science analysis by two cool political scientists, Julia Zeria, who you might know, and William Alder, who did this analysis where they show, for decades, like Republicans have kind of done this one strategy for Veeps, which is coalition like confirmation, right? Mike Pence confirming to evangelicals that Trump is going to have their back and making them feel comfortable to show up in big numbers for him. But Tim Kaine and, all of the picks behind him for Democrats have always been about an appeal to the center of the electorate. The Harris pick is a departure for that. And as I show you in this slide, and I have been showing for people for months, using VoteView data, which is the data that the political scientists use in this analysis, Harris, in terms of all of her votes, so it's a non-subjective analysis. A lot of the ones that you get from interest groups are, of course, subjectively coded. This is all of the votes ever in the Senate, relative to everybody else. Is a very liberal voting record. Of course, that makes sense. She's a senator from California, so she has the freedom to be pretty liberal. But in terms of this pick, this is more of a Republican strategy in the pick than it is a traditional Democratic strategy, which is, the do no harm kind of appeal to the center pick. So when Biden talks about like a bridge to tomorrow, the Harris pick is both a pick ideologically that is much more progressive, much more liberal in that down payment to the future, but also it's really indicative of the party's obvious investment in what I would call coalition turnout in terms of their strategy. So, just because that forward-facing messaging in the convention, which by the way, only 26 million or 28 million people watch, most of the people that they need to watch the convention are not the people that a campaign would have to target. Campaigns are for people who are not like us, okay? We watch the convention. The campaign is for people who don't watch the convention. Sadly enough, only a very small portion of the electorate and only the most tuned in portions of the electorate bother to watch such things. So anyway, so I thought you might be interested in seeing that data and kind of hearing how it relates to what we're seeing in some of the polling data and how, how inelastic that Trump voter has been in terms of these events, which have been just catastrophic events. I'll close out with this other graph that's been really popular on Sunday election Twitter, which is asking, voters, and it's broken down by party, Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, if the deaths that America has suffered, which is now above 170,000 and projected possibly, even to hit 300,000 by the end of the year now, if no strategic change is made, or if they're acceptable, right? And again, every policy is a reflection of that party allegiance, right? So when a Republican is answering this question, they're answering it from a place of, I must defend the president who's guiding this response. So as you can see, 57% of Republicans in that, team Republican tribalism say, hey, this is a acceptable number of deaths, right? Which is, as many people have pointed out, a very high number for a party of, the sanctity of life and whatnot. But what I really wanted to point out to you is the independent data. So you look at the independent data, and you might wonder, well, 67% of independents say it's not acceptable. What's up with this 33%? And what that 33% is the 33% of independents who are what we call right-leaning independents, and that means they are closet Republicans. And so they, too, are kind of taking one for the team in their response. They are hesitant to say that it's not acceptable, because if they do in the poll, then they are betraying the team. And that team, of course, is Donald Trump, who is leading this response. So it's really important. And one of the things that I'll close off saying is that, like the way that the stump journalists do these interviews on the stump with voters, like, oh, who are you going to vote for? And is it about the economy? The voter will talk about, oh, I'm a small business owner, and it's really about the economy and da-da-da-da-da. Like, the way that I would do stump interviews is totally different. Like, the first thing out of my mouth would be like, so, are you a Republican or a Democrat? Like, oh, because that's all that matters, right? Do you lean one way or the other? And I'm beginning to realize, as I move through this, like from the academic world into this more, data journalism type of environment, and especially into the campaign nexus, is that's not like the way that the campaign world, the journalism world thinks about people, still very much focused on demographics, like, oh, is it evangelical, or it's a college educated woman, and like they don't use this blunt sorting device of party the way that academics do. And because of that was probably appropriate, to be honest with you, 30 years ago, but in terms of now, like, that first cut, so like that doesn't, all of the other part of the answer is irrelevant, because the woman's voting for Trump because she's a Republican. Like, it doesn't matter about how she feels about his performance on the economy before this pandemic came in, or whatever answer she gives, because the fact is, like, she's going to vote for him because he's got the R and she's got the R, and they're on Team R, right? So the social scientist, political scientist understanding of that power is very different. I'm coming to appreciate that really much more. So anyway, that's your first go ahead, make my data, Bitecofer data drop, and I hope you enjoyed it.